Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. This week, I have Dr. Rob Leone on as my guest, and we have so much to talk about this week, but let me first introduce you to Rob. He is a professor, speaker, and consultant with over 20 years of experience in leadership, organizational development, and performance improvement. Known for his innovative people-first approach, which I know we all can appreciate, Rob specializes in helping organizations build human-centric, sustainable systems that fuel growth and success. Drawing on his expertise in human behavior and workplace psychology, he demystifies leadership and equips clients with science-based and science-backed strategies to enhance culture, build stronger teams, and drive meaningful impact. Rob's work focuses on aligning individual strengths with organizational needs, ensuring that leaders and their teams can thrive together, which is exactly why Rob is on the podcast, because this is a values alignment, if I've ever seen one, between the podcast and the mission behind your work, Rob. So thank you so much for being here and for spending some time with us, sharing your insights.
Absolutely. And thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Of course. Well, with that, I am going to try and get as much of your insight out as possible, because you obviously have a really distinct way of approaching organizational needs. One that, as I've already mentioned, is absolutely in line with what I'm trying to convey in this podcast, that there is so much more to how we lead and how we manage our businesses. And it starts with being human-centric. So when it comes to workplace psychology and all of these things that you leverage to execute on some of these things, where does that inspiration or that interest from you come from?
That's a good question. And we only have 30 minutes, right? So
plus or minus. We have time.
I've always been interested in doing better and not like self-development, doing better. Like, of course, that's a part of the journey, but just, I, as a kind of young employee, a junior employee, I'd look at things and think, I wonder if there's a better way or a different way, and how we could accomplish this and change this and make this work. And that's basically been the theme of my career, is that I would interact with a system, a job, people, whatever that is, and go, I wonder what else is out there. How can we make this better? And then eventually it led me into the doctorate that focused on enhancing performance strategies for that. Then eventually it led to, well, if I have these strategies, but they're not sticking, what's behind that? And that led into the human behavior aspect to figure out, let's understand the people better and how they function and how they're different, but in many cases how they're similar, and work with those leaders to better understand that piece. And then the solution becomes that much easier to execute on. So that's part of that demystifying process. And it's always been within me, like, hey, how can I do this better? What can we do differently? What's next? I think I exhaust some people with that.
I mean, if you're exhausting them, then they might not be approaching things the way that we would like them to. Speaking of, we talked about self-awareness just before we started recording. Those are probably the people who maybe lack a little bit. I'm not exhausted by anything that you're saying, because I completely kind of subscribe to this mentality that there is always a better way of doing something. This is frankly exactly why I started my podcast, because I was so frustrated by what I was seeing from leaders who, whether they were in HR or they were in other parts of the business, claimed to be thought leaders, claimed to be people who were challenging the status quo, and they just weren't. And I don't know who lied to them, but I was not going to. And, I just was like, well, I'm not going to be frustrated. I'm just going to do something about it. And it sounds like that's really kind of where you're coming from, that you're like, oh, well, these things can be done better, so let's just do it better.
Yeah. And I want to make it really clear, like there's some people that are just kind of change junkies, change for the sake of change.
Mm,
And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really examining what is happening and what isn't happening, getting deep enough into it to understand what are our options at this point, and making well-informed decisions to enhance, whether it's a practice, a system, a process, whatever that is, to the betterment of the group and the organization. And to your point, yeah, like everyone that signs up on social media gets to complete their bio tagline, right? Thought leader and such like that.
yeah,
So, and that's one of the things we compete with, because I see a lot of people chasing like what authors write in books, and anyone could write a book, right? And in fact, many people could pay to write a book, have it written for
true.
them, right? So
That's true.
I really have a challenge with some of the books that are coming out, because they aren't evidence based, or quite frankly, I don't think they're accurate or helpful or healthy. And so I use that as a backdrop against kind of that more scientific discipline practice of what we know, and then leveraging that to do what we need to do.
Well, that's a great place for us to move into my next question for you, because this concept of being science backed and really leveraging evidence and facts to then help you to make these decisions, I think is really interesting. We see this all the time in real life, hopefully, where people are using data or different facts that they're collecting to make certain decisions. Of course, we also see where people don't do that. But when we at least lead with the former, then we can make thoughtful decisions. And something that I know that we spoke about when we first spoke a few months ago was this idea of prioritizing culture and performance at the same time, simultaneously. And so I'm curious what evidence you have or that you found that supports doing that, supports looking at culture and performance in the same vein
Yeah.
or at the same time.
Well, let's go back to those two categories you created: those that use data, right, and those that don't. And I take those that use and split it out one more time.
Mm.
And not everyone's trained to read and diagnose and interpret the information properly. And that is what I see a lot of that I'm concerned about, is that in some instances, in many instances, especially when we get into satisfaction and engagement and these other surveys that might have some open-ended statements in it, that they say, look, I don't get paid enough for this, or I need more recognition. I think those are in some instances cry for help, comma, symptoms of something that's much deeper within the organization and their relationship with the organization, but they don't possess the language or the knowledge on how to articulate that. And so it's really important when we look at these things that we really look at them and really question them against the landscape of what's going on in that organization. And if that even means let's go into a focus group afterwards and say, what do you think this meant? What did you mean by this? And thread it out further. We often find that our interpretations are going in the wrong direction, and we are then resorting to solutions that are good money thrown at poor solutions. And that's what I'm trying to really be mindful of, is whatever we do with a group, we're being good stewards of their resources, because they're limited, and the resource of time's limited, the resources of money's limited. And so let's make sure that we do what's best. And that brings us into this evidence-based approach. So what we're observing in your group, in your team, what does that really mean, and what's happening, and how does that kind of, if I compare that to what I know what's happening in the literature, the research, the scholarship, what's happening here versus there is going to now help me make some decisions on what we need to do with your group, which I think is much more accurate than taking what we've read in the feedback survey and then comparing it to a book.
Right.
And, we're going to get branded as attacking authors.
I know, the anti-author group.
Yeah, exactly. And comparing it to a book or something of the popular press or a trade journal, magazine, things like that. And when I bring this up, I want to encourage us to tread lightly on this, because many instances, and if you think about it, if you've gone to a conference and you've sat in a 45-minute session or keynote about how someone made a difference, and then all you need to do is follow their steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it's going to work. It's this. That's my problem with how many books present that information. They make it sound that it's transferable, but the success of anything is based on context.
True.
And if we understand what the context is, we can better understand the success of the initiative. And that's why in many instances, when we go, hey, Tracy, go to this conference, learn about change management, bring it back to the organization, and help us make the changes here. And it's a little bit naive, but we do this a lot, and we spend a lot of money to do this. And when you come back, it didn't occur to you that that person that was talking was maybe of a team of 20 and your organization's 150, or there's some other element of complexity there that you don't know about. And so there's a high likelihood of failure or breakdown for that transfer. And so what we're trying to do is just be careful with what we do, make good decisions, lots of conversations with our partners or our clients. We like to talk to them as partners, refer to them as partners, to really determine what they see and what they understand and what they feel, so that we could pull those words together. Because we see this time and time again. We get called into organizations by people who know there's a problem. So that's awesome. And then we get into the conversation of what they think the problem is and why it exists. And that's where we have to start reading between the lines, because in many instances, those leaders or managers are just too close to the situation that they're not able to. And this is why they haven't resolved it over time, is that their assumptions are based on the wrong data set, essentially, in the situation. Yeah,
that's really interesting. And as you were sharing that too, I was thinking about how one of the failure points when we, even on this podcast, we share a lot of strategies, like whether it's from me in a solo episode or with another guest, like tons and tons and tons of strategies and resources and books and websites and companies, tons. However, something that I always come back to is that unless you're in, this is kind of where you're talking about context and circumstances, but when you're in an environment that doesn't support those strategies, or you are not necessarily in a decision-making capacity in an organization that potentially doesn't support those strategies, that strategy might not work. It probably won't work, actually. Exactly. And so then it's like, okay, well, if someone is listening or reading or whatever it is that however they're interacting with these resources and strategies, if they then have decision-making authority or have some influence, then yeah, sure, maybe sometimes those strategies can be implemented. But to your point, again, I agree that there's a level of context that needs to be understood here, and it would be silly for any of us, whether it's the two of us talking about this on this platform, or for those who are looking to implement new strategies, to think that there is a one size fits all to any of this. Which is why I think it's really interesting that you have this data and science backed approach to things, and it does make me wonder, when we do further break down this culture and performance and looking at them simultaneously, where you see some of the breakdown when you are confronted, especially with this kind of recognition that people don't always have the right understanding of the data or of the problem. How do you then reconcile that and then move forward to be able to improve those things in an organization?
Yeah, gently, I guess, is the first answer, right? It's tough because people don't know what they don't know. And even I don't know what I don't know. But I do have a certain level of expertise in this very narrow set of information. And so it's really just pulling things together and stepping back and really seeking to understand it. But I can't speak to enough how important it is to gain perspective. And whether that's focus groups, observations, we use a lot of surveys in general in organizations. I'm not talking about us as a business. I mean, a lot of organizations use surveys. They're helpful. They give us a starting point, but we often need to get in there deeper, because what we know is that it's important for the organization to perform so that we can pay our employees.
Right.
Well, we also need those employees to be happy and healthy in order for that organization to perform, right? And it's finding that balance between the two. I often talk to people about my ambition is that the work we do helps change the system in a way that the people at the end of the day go home with enough fuel in their tanks, their emotional tanks, to be present with, the people they love, or the activities they want to do after, whether that's, being with family or friends or volunteering, or maybe even getting to the gym, right? Just because, when you've lived in those environments and you're drained at the end of the day, and it's okay. We could work hard and be drained in terms of, like, say, seasons or based on days. But if it's relentless and it doesn't stop, it starts to erode away our well-being. And then when our well-being and our attention and our energy is eroded, our ability to focus and concentrate on the objectives, the priorities, the goals starts to diminish. We also know that as emotions and stress bear us down and weigh us down, we become less friendly with people. Our demeanor changes, and that has a consequence on the type and quality of the relationships. So the argument for me is that we can prioritize both. And what we see too often is that only one's prioritized, or the other. And I hate when I run into this with people, that someone over the years has prioritized culture over performance, and it ended up being a mechanism to protect the employee's best interests. And we have to be careful and maintain the employee's interests, but we also have to steward the organization so the organization's doing what it's set out to do, so that those employees can continue to have a job. Mm-hmm. And so we also know that, and we've seen this for many years, a high frequency of performance. Employees are expendable. We can replace them. You need to live up to this, or just watch AI's coming, so you either shape up or you're shipped out, type of thing. It's another conversation for another day that relates to implications. But we just burn through people. And if you're like the majority of people that live in the US, you're in smaller communities, and you don't have an endless well of people to draw upon to move into these positions. So it's essential that we find that balance. And maybe it is a little bit more performance centric and the culture's a little less, or maybe it's a little bit more, we need to prioritize culture more, because our mission, let's talk about nonprofits, our mission is of sorts to really serve people. But we know with our nonprofit employees that they'll prioritize everyone else before themselves, and that will drain them and diminish their effectiveness. So it's finding the balance that works. Getting back to what we said earlier, context. What is it that your organization needs and aspires to be, and what's it going to take for us to get there?
Yeah, that really makes sense to me. I personally have a belief, and I've seen how it works, that companies who spend time focusing on the culture don't have to worry as much about performance, because inevitably, of course, there's always a very small percentage of people who underperform. We always, generally organizations talk about underperformers way more often than they need to, because it's like such a small percentage usually. But I have found that it really is kind of like a very simple equation to success. You focus on the people, whether that's making sure that they are paid adequately, that they have access to benefits, that they have a schedule that's clear to them, that they know exactly what they're supposed to do. Like a full employee experience is considered and thought about. And then they perform. And whether you focus on culture or not, there will always be underperformers. And when you focus on the culture, then that performance, it's not just internal, it's also what impacts your customers, or depending on, who the, external customer is, whether it's a vendor or a customer, an end user, whatever, that they end up having great customer experience also. And for whatever reason, no matter how many times you can use data to back this argument up, there are organizations still that don't focus on culture, whether it's because they don't believe the data, they don't read it, they don't want to agree. Maybe it's harder to focus on culture for some leaders than to focus on performance, because they're used to just managing performance rather than driving culture, because it is a bit of a different muscle. But I really do believe that if organizations today just stopped worrying about performance and they just focus on the experience that employees get when they work at their company, they would probably never have to talk about improving performance again.
I agree wholeheartedly. A couple thoughts that come to mind. First off, culture is going to occur by design or default. That's bullet number
Ooh,
one,
I like that.
right? Bullet number two, you're going to have to pay for it at some point, either on the front end with purposeful design or on the back end after that default. And you find yourselves in all sorts of undesirable situations, whether it's lawsuits, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Another thought, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that we put that work into the culture, it actually starts to fix things before they break. And if we could actually add a little tweak to that culture with a special perspective on self-leadership and peer accountability, higher organizational citizenship behaviors, things like that, it
Mm-hmm.
lessens the load for the leader. The employees start to hold each other accountable. Those people that maybe don't fit or don't buy into the cultural framework begin to realize that they no longer have an audience when they're trying to stir the pot, and they eventually self-select out of the organization. The other side of it is now when we get ready to hire someone, because we speak so highly of our culture and it's such a driving force in our organization, we use that as criteria in our screening process. We make it very clear in our onboarding process so that they integrate well. And it really is, to me, the grease in the gears that makes it easier for us to have difficult conversations. It makes it easier for us to respond to maybe poor fit hires, right? Because hiring is, there's definitely a science to it, but very few people follow that science. And, they respond to very superficial, impressionistic things. And then we find, and because what's the number one objective of the person being interviewed? To get the job, even though they might not have the framework or the desire or the personality dimensions to succeed in that job, they want the job. And so I have organizations that say, oh no, we're good. We don't need any help. And I share with them, I said, I think you do need help, in fact, and you're probably one bad hire away from learning that, because we see people misattribute their successes. And so we could have a great team. That leader could have nothing to do with it whatsoever. It could be based on the chemistry of the team. And so once that chemistry shifts because we lose someone, retirement, relocation, we bring in someone else that really changes the dynamics of that team. Now the leader's in a tough spot because what they thought they were doing that was working is no longer going to work. So a variety of different things there. And in fact, if I could share a resource real quick.
Yeah, please.
Back when you and I met last time, an article came out in Spark magazine that I wrote called "What If Culture Was the Strategy?" or is the strategy. I can't remember exactly what it is, but if you go search out on LinkedIn, it changes that, because we spend so much time on the strategy element that if we, to your point, that performance piece, that if we don't have the right inputs, we don't have the right people, the players, the processes, it's going to be very difficult for us to get those objectives. And we can actually shift our practice away from strategy and strategic planning, because there's a whole bunch of mixed emotions I have about it. There's certain groups that should be doing it, certain groups it's not essential. But if they fix the culture parts, that non-essential group will actually drive the pieces that need to be driven for that strategy.
I like that. What if culture is the strategy? It's a perfect question. And
Yeah.
and I think we're kind of saying that it is. And
Yeah.
it's so interesting because it's easy for us to talk about it because we're aligned in our values. We agree. Like, it's great. I love when we agree. Yay. But there are HR people out there. There are probably HR people who listen to my podcast who vehemently disagree with my perspective. And maybe they keep listening because they like to find someone who they disagree with, or maybe they're listening because they want to find a different way of leading themselves. But I know that we both know, because there are organizations who still don't focus on culture as a strategy, but we know that there is a pitfall here, that there are organizations, people, individuals, more specifically, who don't subscribe to this thought process, who don't believe that employees need to be happy or engaged in order for businesses to make money, because at the end of the day, that is their goal. That, except unless you're a nonprofit and maybe your goal is more mission based, but the end of the day, even a mission-driven for-profit company is for profit.
Yeah.
That's their goal, is to create profit. So I'm curious if in your research and your experience, if you've been able to take that type of antithetical belief that, oh, well, it doesn't really matter, we're going to make money anyway, if we even whether it's culture by default or design, to your point, what evidence or research have you seen, or have you kind of referenced for people who are of that belief, in an effort to help them to see that it's going to be a much easier time for them if they focus on culture as a strategy rather than performance as a strategy?
Yeah, we think about this in terms of a spectrum, right? Of
Mm.
just how ingrained are they in their belief. Look, there's some organizations or some industries or some products that just make so much money that they're happy and fine with what they do.
Like private equity, maybe.
Or marijuana, right?
Yeah.
Like these things
Or
that are
that.
just like,
Or that.
yeah, they just,
No
yeah,
one's concerned
that
about the employees at a dispensary.
exactly, like, hey, we have enough baked in rewards, and
That's
it's like, yes, you do.
hilarious.
However, we can do something different, right? Like, but
Yeah.
there are just some that just some exist that they don't need to pay as close attention to
Sure,
this, and
sure.
unless they really have a shift in mindset, or a mission shift within their heart, it's tough to win them over. The others are that range and that spectrum that are, why do people believe what they believe? Well, through a variety of different inputs and experiences in their life. And some are good, some are bad, some are misread, all sorts of things. We're complex. So we could pull in some data, but those are the really tough ones to turn. Like,
Mm.
it's a lot easier when someone's like, I heard about you and I don't really believe in this stuff that much, but we're in trouble. So at least they're admitting that there's an issue, right? So there's my window. That's the crack in the window. It's open a little bit, so I could open it all the way and step in.
Mm-hmm.
So we could start talking about some of the data that relates to engagement or performance or psychological safety or retention, depending on what it is that they're experiencing, to help make it more relevant to them. And if they are opening that window just a bit, or that door just a bit, to let me get in a little bit, we usually go through that process very nicely, because I could quickly identify what some of their challenges are and help, and without them even disclosing them, ask questions and provide scenarios and examples that really resonate with that. Because as much as we think we're unique in many aspects, we are unique. There's a lot of commonalities in terms of personality, behavior, organizations, and systems. And when we talk about, what industries we work with, because people say you need to be industry specific, we say, well, we're not. We're industry agnostic, but context specific, because people are people are people. The industry does shift some of it, but the science of motivation, or science of behavior, or science of decision making, is true in all these different environments. There's just context to it that influences, say, the flavor or the approach of all those things. And so that's how we approach those, is to make sure that we're aware of those pieces, those assumptions, those beliefs, the demographics that lead into whatever that organization looks like in terms of its employees, as those are important parts of this process. So I'd like to say that I'm a lot more successful with converting those people. But what's happened was, when we were a young, formalized organization, we were spending a lot of time chasing organizations, because you learn about who's unhealthy, who needs
Yeah.
help. People tell you a lot of these things, especially as a professor. My students are like, look, we need help at our group, or stuff like that. And then you talk to them and they're like, no, we're perfect. Nothing's wrong here. Look at all the awards, best place to work, all
Yeah.
these different awards. And it's like,
Which
okay.
companies pay for generally, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Part of the marketing plan, right?
Right.
And
You have to pay to play, I should say. They don't pay to
yes,
win, but they've got to
I
pay to play. Yeah.
exactly. And so what's been fortunate for us is that we've done enough work for long enough that we have enough credibility that our business is over 90% referral based.
Wow.
So when we do have a conversation, they're already warmed up to the idea with working with us.
Right. Because they know
And so I don't
what's in
have
it
to,
for them at that
yeah,
point.
I don't
Yeah.
have to really get to that conversion point,
No,
right?
referrals are the way to go. Honestly, for everything, actually.
Yeah.
Referrals are the way to go in
Yeah.
hiring too.
Yeah.
This is something I'm leaning into at my organization is like, if we can really like we had never speaking of data, actually, we had never really like we tracked employee referrals, but we never measured employee
Hmm.
referrals. We never decided, okay, this is our goal or this is where we want to be, or even measured like the average tenure of our referrals. I was like, we have all this information, we're doing nothing with it. Like we've
Yeah.
got to do something. And lo and behold, we have almost 18% of our organization is from employee referrals, or currently, from they were sourced by someone who referred them.
Yeah.
And the average tenure is longer than that of a non-refer, which is typical as we, in organizations. But nevertheless, we're like, oh, well, if we want to get to 30%, now we know what we need to do. We need to have X number of referrals for every opening or whatever. And it's just like a knowledge is power kind of
Yeah.
thing. And going back to all of what you've just shared, people don't know what they don't know. And
Yeah.
when we have this window of opportunity, to use your analogy, there's there's so much opportunity for us to really help people to see what the impact is of every decision that we make. Like even with this example that I've just shared within my own organization, employee referrals, focusing on that as an example, not only are you getting the benefit of someone really like identifying someone who's really committed, because you're not going to refer someone unless you're really committed to that organization, you
Hmm.
believe it as it is an amazing place to work, and so you have someone really committed who's referring someone else who's probably going to be really committed. So now you have maximum commitment from these people. And then on top of that, you have this measurement of how many people believe in that workplace or that organization. So when we really kind of come to this concept of data and science backed decision making, you do only know what you know, and yet there's so much information that you can go and acquire and try to analyze in an effort to paint not only a better picture of what's actually happening at an organization, but also decide what you want to do or what decisions you need to make in order to drive the culture further. So that's just my own example on that. um, we're kind of coming up on time here, which I don't even know how that's possible because I feel like we just started. But one of the final questions that I have for you is, for companies that are getting the culture piece right,
Hmm.
whether it's in their hiring or kind of full scope end to end, their whole employee experience, is there a place where they're starting? Is it the culture by design, or is it that their culture defaulted to something that was really not great and they actively intentionally work to improve their culture? Or maybe it's both.
Yeah. I think it's all of the above, right? It's everyone's journey is different. Um, but everyone could be on the journey, right? And it's what causes us to take this journey, right? So is it crises? Is it a risk of losing funding?
Hmm.
Risk of losing market share? Um, Other things that are okay, lawsuit related that are really rattling things, right? So maybe we need to make some cultural shifts for out of like a compliance framework, but then it becomes a part of the identity of the organization. So all of those things are true. There's to me it's just when you're going to start, what steps you're going to take. It doesn't need to be huge. It doesn't need to be um, super expensive buy-in, stuff like that. You could start at a smaller level. You could start with cohorts. A lot of groups we work with, we start with the executive level, and then we work down into divisions that are needing the most help. So a little bit more of an informed strategic approach, because resources are limited, and not to mention you can't just pull everyone off the line to do
Totally.
everything right all the time. So there's all these. I just encourage people to be curious and open to it. I don't ever want to feel like we come across, because I think we can at times become culture snobs, or that those people are less because they're not doing this, and that's not the case. Life's complicated and complex, um, and like we said, we only know what we know, and then we're in charge of all these different people, right? And
Hmm.
it's just a whole bunch of uncertainty there, and it's an endorsement though for the need to reach out to someone that could see it from a different perspective, that can help walk you through some options that will make sense for your particular industry, culture, team, stuff like that, to start making those journeys.
Mm.
I had a breakfast conversation with someone this morning, and they're like, "We need to do some strategy work. I'm not sure, should we have everyone or just a small group?" I was like, "Well, let's start talking about numbers. What is everyone? What's a small group?" And then, so all these things are kind of situation based, right?
Right.
So
Right.
depending on the size of the team, what's the purpose of the initiative, what we hope to accomplish, there's all different solutions out there for people. And some of it's as easy as, hey, who on your team is maybe more of the learner or growth mindset that would like to be in charge of bringing in professional development to our monthly staff meetings, and they carve out 25 minutes and they're a lead in charge of that. Now that to them, it's a value added experience. It's a resume builder. It's fun. It's new. And to you as the leader, you're just coordinating it and facilitating it so that they could have that experience and really let the people kind of demonstrate their interest. Because just because I don't think we don't need it doesn't necessarily mean that our team believes the same thing. In fact, we know that retention data is tied to development opportunities and support. And that doesn't necessarily have to just be go to a conference, right? So it might cost you $4,000 or $5,000 to send one person to Vegas for a week for our seminar conference. Well, maybe we could take that same money and do something collectively with the entire organization,
Right.
and build internal culture instead of this isolated kind of drip of information. So there's all sorts of ways for us to do this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I appreciate you sharing all of your insights and all of the experiences that you've had, not only in your own business, but also just in general with the people that you've worked with. And I'd love to give you a moment to tell everyone where they can connect with you. And of course, I'll have everything linked in the show notes too, naturally, but sometimes it's good to hear.
Yeah. All right. Well, first off, thank you. I love this. This is so fun. It's great
Oh, good.
to speak with kindred spirits, right?
Yes, I agree.
If you're looking for a website, our company's name is Black River Performance Management, but because that's a super long URL, we've cut it down to Black River, the letter P for performance, the letter M for management.com. So blackriverpm.com. And you can find our bio information in there, some of our project scope of work, things like that. And then on LinkedIn, Rob, and last name spelt like lion, Lion, but as you mentioned, it's Leon. And so just look me up, and I say we because my wife and I oversee this, and then we have other people with us as part of our group. But we have calendars to set up, intake calls, things like that, or just reach out and DM us or DM me through LinkedIn, and we'll go from there. If you want to get really specific in terms of finding me, do blackriverpm.com/Rob, R-O-B, and that'll bring you to this podcast. Will be there among others. Blog entries are in there, the blogs I write, keynote topics, stuff like that. So
amazing.
Yeah, reach out. We'd love to have a conversation.
Amazing. I love it. Well, Rob, thank you so much for your time and again, all of your insights. Really appreciate it.
Terrific. Thank you.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.